Okay, let's get started. Make sure you have the valve timing correct, then perform the following procedure. Turn the crank that 5/6 of a revolution that we just talked about and get your feeler gauge set and positioned correctly. Remember that it is positioned between the number 1 idler pulley stopper and the tensioner body. Then get your buddy to apply that 13 foot-pounds of torque to the number 1 idler pulley bolt, and while they are holding that torque, push on the back of the tensioner and tighten the two 12mm bolts holding the tensioner onto the head. Then remove the feeler gauge, pull the pin, and check the valve timing as outlined in the service manual. Congratulations, you've got it done. Next up is the coolant neck. Connect the filler hose, the radiator hose, the heater water hose, the bypass hose from the bypass pipe, the 2 evap vacuum hoses, and the water bypass hose from the ISC valve. Yeah, it's a lot of hoses. Put on a new gasket and thread it in place. It's easier to get the hoses attached on the bottom, such as those 2 evap vacuum hoses, before you bolt it up. Once it is bolted to the head, you can attach the rest of the hoses. Now let's get that valve cover sealed up. Get some RTV or Toyota sealant and place it next to the intake and exhaust bearing caps on the pulley side. Also glob some sealant around the distributor side bearing cap. Check out my cool arrows for the locations. Check to make sure that the groove on the distributor side of the intake camshaft is vertical. This will make installing the distributor easier. I like to dump a little of my favorite motor oil, Mobil 1, onto the bearing caps and cams. This helps to limit the metal-to-metal contact when you first fire it up. Then we can lay the valve cover down on top of the head. You did take this opportunity to shine up your valve cover, didn't you? Everybody knows that a shiny valve cover results in more horsepower. Then bolt it down with those 10 Phillips screws. It's a good idea to use a new valve cover gasket. Phew! I am getting tired with all this high-speed screw driving. Next up is the fuel rail. It's much easier to install the rail before installing the intake manifold. Make sure everything is clean and install some new fuel injector insulators. When installing the rail, make sure not to drop the insulators, otherwise you'll have a nasty vacuum leak. Move all that wiring out of the way and just place the rail on the head, making sure not to dislodge those insulators. If you're wondering, these injectors are from a 1997 twin-turbo Toyota Supra and are rated at 540 cc's per minute, adding a little more bang to the fire. Well, fuel anyway. Then bolt the rail to the head using the 3 12mm bolts. I like to do the final torquing with a 12mm wrench. Now we can finish up the timing belt by bolting up the last timing belt cover. Since we've already installed the engine mounting bracket, you'll have to wiggle the timing belt cover around to get it into place. It'll go though. Then you gotta bolt up the right side engine mounting insulator. You want to jack up the engine enough to get the insulator into place. You gotta jack it up pretty good. Don't worry though, that oil pan is tough. Then torque the through bolt to 58 foot-pounds. Okay, next up is the intake manifold. Get your TVIS plate prepared with 2 new gaskets. I like to use a little RTV in the corners of the gasket to hold it in place. Then place the plate on the studs on the head. Move the wiring out of the way and place the intake manifold into the engine compartment. In the center of the intake manifold is a location where you can place the wires through. With a little wiggling, you'll get the intake manifold into place. Take your time though, looking for stuff that is in the way, such as vacuum lines or wiring. You may have to look underneath to check fitment. Then get on underneath and bolt the intake manifold and TVIS plate to the head using the 4 bolts and 3 nuts. Tighten everything down in several passes to 14 foot-pounds. Alright, you got it installed. Here's a shot of the wiring that needs to come through the intake manifold. Using the 2 bolts, reconnect the TVIS vacuum tank, TVIS bypass valve, and the turbo bypass valve assembly. Reinstall the number 1 air tube. 1 bolt can be gotten to from underneath. The top bolt is difficult to get to, but I found that a 10mm wrench can be used pretty easily from up top. Bolt back the 2 intake manifold stays and reconnect all the wiring and vacuum lines. Okay, it's on to the distributor. Line up the 2 marks before installing it. It's also a good idea to lubricate the O-ring seal with motor oil before installing the distributor. Then just wiggle the distributor into the head and keep in mind that you are lining up the key groove on the end of the distributor with the keyed groove on the intake camshaft. Once the distributor is in place, check that you cannot turn the rotor. This is a good indication that it has connected with the intake camshaft. Then loosely bolt the distributor to the head with the 2 bolts. And yep, it's a good idea to use some anti-seize. Now we can bolt up that vacuum tube assembly, or as Toyota calls it, the number 2 air tube. Once you have it in place, connect the air hose from the number 1 air tube and the hose from the intake manifold. Time to reinstall the exhaust gas recirculation assembly. Use some anti-seize on those bolts, then install it with the 2 long 12mm bolts and the 2 Allen bolts. It's never a bad idea to use new gaskets. Attach the bypass valve to the intake manifold with the single 12mm bolt. Then connect up all those vacuum lines and the electrical connector. Oh yeah, check out that balding head. Okay, you got the EGR installed. Pretty straightforward.